Hey everybody, welcome to the first official discussion episode of Autopsy. Your friendly death investigator here, and today we're going to talk about, autopsies. It seems only appropriate to go over this as the first discussion episode. For listeners who deal with this kind of stuff, everything I'll go over in a lot of these episodes likely won't be anything new. But like the Autopsy podcast itself, hopefully it'll kind of work for everyone. I have a list of future topics as well, but if you have something interesting or a question you'd like to discuss, you can email autopsypodcast@gmail.com. And as I mentioned at the end of each episode, if you have a report you'd like to send in, you can email that as well. So for today, the main points are who all gets an autopsy and what exactly can an autopsy show. To the first point, let's start with how a doctor once put it to me. In a perfect world, everybody who dies would get a full autopsy. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world, and resource management is the big issue. Resources equate to staffing, that is, doctors and technicians, and equipment, so scalpel blades, personal protection equipment, x-rays, syringes, needles. Other services can factor in, so toxicology and histology, and those services also include their own staffing. I once heard an approximation of roughly $5,000 per case, give or take. That can be a little different or radically different based on the cost of living of your area. And of course, funding for your state or county medical examiner or coroner services are paid via tax dollars. So if a loved one dies and they receive an autopsy, there's no service charge to you. Now, if you decided you don't like the results of the autopsy for whatever reason and want a second one performed, well, then you're going to pay. And you're going to have to do the work of tracking down a pathologist to perform it. This isn't exceptionally hard. Lots of doctors who work for ME offices or hospitals do this as what they call their side work. That said, you can expect to pay upwards of $3,000 for a private autopsy, and I've honestly never heard of one offered less than that. I've also seen them go up to $5,000, $10,000, maybe $15,000 or more. All depends on the doctor, really. But private autopsies are their own discussion, as there are a number of ethical dilemmas to them as well. So going back, if we had all the money and all the people to accommodate the need, everyone would get an autopsy. But that's just not reality. So many agencies enact policies that decide what kind of cases will automatically get an autopsy and what cases need more consideration. And the difference between agencies can be highly significant. Let's start with homicides, because almost every single homicide will get a full autopsy, and that's pretty bankable for almost every office of every state. Now, do me a favor, go to Google, search the word homicide. The definition it spits out to me reads as follows: the deliberate and unlawful killing of one person by another, murder. Now, Google murder. I get the unlawful premeditated killing of one human being by another. And do me one last favor. Ignore all of that. The legal definition of homicide is when one human being causes the death of another. Therefore, not all homicides are murder. I would go into further detail on the legal definition of murder, but legally there are varying degrees of murder, and, from a medical standpoint, they're not particularly relevant here. Most times it's for the courts to decide anyway. Here's an example case. This woman just bought herself a handgun, and wanting to be responsible, she took a course on proper handling of it. She shows up to her workplace and begins to tell her coworker about her new gun. The coworker asks to see it. The woman pulls it out and goes to hand it over. The coworker reaches out to take it, and the woman reaches out to hand it over. Despite her training, the woman is handing it to the coworker with the barrel pointing at the coworker. And as fate and irony would have it, the gun goes off and the coworker is killed. The bullet goes through the coworker's hand and then into her chest, right into her heart. This was a real case, by the way. The autopsy showed the bullet wound of the coworker's hand and lined it up to her chest. Like, it literally showed that her hand as it was like reaching out for the gun and then lined it up to her chest. The woman and coworker were friends. There was no ill intent or premeditation. And the woman really did boast about taking her training course. It's a tragedy, and most rational people would, or should anyway, say that it was simply a freak accident. Medically, though, it cannot be considered an accident. One person caused the death of another. It's a homicide. Anything more than that is decided by the courts. But again, all homicides will get a full autopsy. There are exceptions because there are always exceptions, but there are seriously so few, and even those have outlier issues, that there's no reason to get into it here. And while I wish I could tell you that all homicides get autopsies for purely ethical reasons, that wouldn't be truly honest either. A lot of it has to do with the fact that most homicides will go to court, and court requires evidence, and most of the significant evidence for homicides comes from the autopsy. So while many pathologists will tell you that no case takes priority over another, that's mostly true, but homicides by their nature will take up more resources. So that's homicides on a purely baseline level. And we'll kind of go over cases based on their manner here. So next up, we'll go over accidents. Some accidents require an autopsy. Some don't. And again, agencies have different policies. An example would be drownings. If a body is randomly found in the water, then it will definitely come in for an exam. But let's say a man is out swimming on a lake, and there are many people around. And let's say many people see this man struggle and go under and not come back up. 911 is called, and hours later, the body is pulled from the lake. Some agencies may say that this case would not need an autopsy, the idea being that in this case, there were multiple witnesses who saw him struggle and go under. A coroner or investigator can look over the body externally while still on scene and see if there are any injuries that might warrant further examination. If there aren't, it doesn't really necessitate further resources. This could actually be an on-the-fence kind of case. An investigator might think it doesn't need to come in, but maybe the family are really pushing for an exam. That would definitely tip towards getting an autopsy. On the other hand, some families don't like the idea of autopsies and will request, if possible, not to have one. That would tip towards not coming in. That said, there are some who might ask, what if the man was swimming and started having a heart attack? So if you have a heart attack in bed at home and pass away, that would be a manner of death of natural. If you have a heart attack while swimming in a lake and that causes you to go under, while it may be a contributing factor and likely would have been the cause of death in another situation, at the end of the day, the thing that killed you the quickest, we'll say, will be the drowning. Again, if a family suspects a coronary event, they can push for the case to come in, but even if they're right and the man shows signs of a heart attack, the case will still be signed out as a drowning and a manner of accident. Now, let's say a person is driving down the road, speeding on their motorcycle. They come to a red light and go to run it and get hit by another intersecting vehicle. I use a motorcycle accident here because oftentimes the trauma is usually pretty significant for them externally, meaning an investigator on scene can pretty well assess what the cause of death is, most of the time. This would be another accident manner type of case that doesn't really need an autopsy. Change a few circumstances, though. Let's say the person crosses through a green light and the intersecting vehicle that strikes them is someone who just ran their red light. In the first scenario, it was the motorcyclist who broke the law, and so charges won't be pending against the other driver. In this case, the motorcyclist was in full compliance of the law and the other driver is in violation. Now there are charges pending, and now the case may go to court. And as we've already discussed, court cases need evidence, so ipso facto, now an autopsy is kind of required. Even if the injuries are still very clear on scene, at this point you kind of want a doctor to give it a thorough professional assessment, which can be used in court. And again, I'm doing very broad strokes on these examples and explanations. If there's something you want clarified, definitely write in. And now's a good time to remind you all again, patreon.com/autopsypodcast for support for more episodes of the show and more of these discussions. If you have time, please leave a review on iTunes, but leaving a simple star rating is helpful too if you don't have time. Both really help. Facebook.com/autopsypodcast, Twitter.com/autopsy_podcast, and all of these links are listed on our website, autopsypod.com. So we've touched on homicides and accidents. Now let's look at suicides. A person shoots themselves in the head. On scene, there's a clear entrance and exit defect. I say defect here because, well, pathologists kind of pride themselves on being the only folks who can officially, legally say entrance wound and exit wound. I won't chide them too much, but just for clarification, if I say the word defect, just know I mean bullet wound. Anyway, that's a discussion too. Maybe. So a person shoots themselves, clear entrance and exit defects, leaves a suicide note, has a history of depression, etc. Many agencies would say this case does not need to come in for an exam, but suicides can be pretty sensitive as far as families go. They might insist on an exam. In that case, it could come in. There are policies, but agencies do try to be accommodating when they can. Now, same scenario again, except this time the bullet didn't exit. Now, this is where things can boil down to different agencies' policies. Some agencies might say the case needs to come in because bullets don't need to be buried. So an exam will happen just to pull the bullet out. On the other hand, some agencies might not have a problem with burying bullets. All other things being equal, they might decide the case doesn't need an exam. So check your local listings, I guess. Now, suicide hangings can be a bit different. A person might have a history of depression and threatening suicide and may even have left a note. But the majority of hangings still tend to come in for an examination. Another case. A man once put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. It was an old revolver with old bullets, possibly even a .22 caliber. And for people who do this kind of work for a living, trust me, I'll do a more scathing review of .22s at some point. They're a nightmare, I know. But this guy fires this gun, this old gun with this old bullet, and all the bullet managed to do was, well, it didn't even penetrate through the skin. It got close, and I'm sure it hurt like the devil, but it did not do what the man intended. So he wound up hanging himself. And of course, yes, the case came in for an examination. Did it need it? Probably not, but again, hangings get somewhat special treatment. And that's not to say, it's not like there's a ton of cases where someone was murdered and it was made up to look like a hanging. In fact, that is an absolute rarity. On a personal level, I often wonder if TV and film plays into this paranoia, I guess you could call it. Like, I think you could make just as significant an argument that suicides via gunshot wounds can be staged just as easily as hangings, if not more so. But hangings tend to make people pause for whatever reason. And here I'll pause because in the silence right now, I'm pretty sure I can hear the screams in the distance, and they all sound like Jeffrey Epstein. Let me just say, if I can get my hands on that autopsy report, I'll absolutely do an episode. But for the moment, the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner has only released a summary of findings page. I might do a hybrid discussion episode just on that, though, in the meantime. There's a lot to say about that case. I definitely lean towards he probably killed himself. I know that makes me one of like 5 people. Obviously, I love the memes, but yeah, that's a case that they really just need to release the report on. So yeah, I'm just going to table this discussion. Anyway, that's your baseline for suicides. Moving on to natural deaths. Most of these fall into the realm of as long as there is a documented history, which most of the time there is, but not always, and as long as the family is not pressing any matters, then most of these cases don't necessitate an autopsy. Sometimes families press the matter just for peace of mind, but with cases like this, they don't always get their way. Medical examiner offices just have too much to do most of the time, and if there's no suspicions of foul play, it likely won't come in. But a family can still pay for a hospital to do a private autopsy. And private autopsies in this respect are fine, in my opinion, but there are other scenarios that I have a problem with them. And again, medical examiner offices have limited resources. Anyone can get an autopsy for any reason if it's being paid for out of pocket, but when limited tax dollars are involved, well, again, resource management is the key term here. Now, those are your 4 main manners of death. Yes, there is a 5th manner called undetermined, but that doesn't really play into this discussion. Almost by definition, an undetermined manner of death is determined after an autopsy has already been performed. So now we have a broad idea of the kinds of cases that come in for a medical examiner autopsy. So what exactly can they show, these autopsies? This will be a brief discussion, because really, most autopsies, when you boil them down, show you what you probably already know. A homicide victim dies via stab wounds or gunshot wounds. Autopsies can help show paths of these wounds, what specifically they struck that caused death, but at the end of the day, it's still manner of death homicide and cause of death stab wounds or gunshot wounds, or both. A motor vehicle accident will show blunt force trauma. A person with stage 4 cancer will show stage 4 cancer. And my point is, most cases kind of are what they are, but the autopsy is still necessary because if it can't be confirmed, then it can't be proven, which that sounds redundant, but it's true. But we still do the autopsy because sometimes the doctors will find variations because sometimes it's not so simple. It's why every case gets treated as its own thing. You see 1,000 gunshot wound cases, and so many of them are the same. But then you see one that's a little different and can mean something different in court. The Russell Derman case is a great example. There's plenty of decapitation cases out there, and as we saw with that case, at first look, that seemed like it would be the likely cause of death. But the autopsy showed that it wasn't. And that kind of information might be useful. If the head was ever recovered, there might be similar blunt force injuries the way his wife had them, or maybe there's a gunshot wound with a bullet inside, and maybe that's why they took the head to begin with, so that it couldn't be recovered and traced. Yeah, you can really go down the rabbit holes with the whys and hows of that case. If you're playing the odds, they'd probably favor that the head is somewhere at the bottom of Lake Oconee, akin to a needle in a haystack at this point. But I think I'll leave this discussion right here. Again, any questions or addendums you might like to add can be emailed to autopsypodcast@gmail.com. And I promise I'll address them in future discussions. That might even be a segment. Things your friendly death investigator got kind of not super correct. There's a segment. Anyways, guys, thank you all for listening, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves and each other.